The dawn light over the Egyptian desert on the 4th of November, 1942, revealed a landscape scarred by weeks of ferocious attrition, a stalemate of minefields and trenches that had halted the Allied advance just 12 kilometers west of El Alamein. In the cool air of the early morning, Lieutenant Colonel Reevesmore sat within the cramped steel confines of his Marmon-Herrington armored car, the engine idling with a rhythmic vibration that resonated through the chassis. Behind him, a column of 17 South African armored cars waited, their crews tense and alert, engines running in anticipation of a maneuver that defied the conventional wisdom of armored warfare. The context of this moment was defined by failure. 2 previous attempts by heavy British armored brigades to smash through the German defensive line had ended in disaster, with infantry pinned down by machine gun fire and tanks left burning in the minefields, victims of the lethal German anti-tank screens. The offensive, Montgomery's great hope, had stalled, and the momentum seemed to be slipping away into the sand. Yet, Reevesmore checked his watch, knowing that in 3 minutes his light-wheeled vehicles would attempt what the heavy tracks of the British armour could not achieve. At precisely 6:30, the signal was given, and A and B squadrons of the 4th, 6th South African Armoured Car Regiment did not crawl forward, but accelerated violently, engines roaring as they surged into the narrow gap between the German 15th Panzer Division and the 90th Light Division, moving at speeds touching 80 kilometers per hour. These 17 vehicles became a blur against the desert backdrop, tearing straight into the vulnerable rear areas of the German lines. The sheer velocity of the assault paralyzed the defenders, who were accustomed to the slow, grinding pace of tank warfare. They were unprepared for a motorized cavalry charge that bypassed their frontal defenses entirely. By 7 o'clock hours, a mere 30 minutes after the order to advance was given, the South Africans had wreaked havoc on the German infrastructure, capturing 2 terrifying 88mm guns, 2 105mm howitzers, 2 110mm guns, and securing 230 German prisoners who were left bewildered by the suddenness of their capture. The breakthrough that had been deemed impossible by heavy armor was accomplished in half an hour by vehicles that were essentially armored trucks, creating a shockwave of confusion that rippled through the German command structure. British accounts from that morning describe a scene of utter disarray spreading through the enemy rear, a testament to the psychological impact of speed and surprise. This event was not an anomaly, but the culmination of a long, bitter struggle in which South African armored cars had consistently proven to be the thorn in the side of the Afrika Korps, a nimble adversary that refused to play by the rules of engagement dictated by Germany's tactical superiority. To understand the magnitude of this achievement, one must recognize the dire situation the Allies faced in North Africa by mid-1942, where German forces had established a dominance that seemed almost insurmountable. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had pushed the British 8th Army back to the very borders of Egypt, leveraging a tactical acumen that left Allied commanders reeling. The German advantage was not merely in the quality of their tanks or the discipline of their infantry, but in the realm of intelligence, where Rommel seemed to possess an uncanny ability to predict British movements. The German 621st Signals Intelligence Company was a master of its craft, monitoring Allied radio traffic around the clock and providing Rommel with advanced warnings of every major maneuver, allowing him to position his lethal anti-tank screens exactly where they would cause the most devastation. Furthermore, German reconnaissance units, equipped with the sophisticated SD, KFC 222 and 231 armored cars, roamed the desert, gathering detailed information on British dispositions. This intelligence superiority meant that battles were often decided before the first shot was fired, as Rommel knew where the British tanks were, when they were moving, and where they intended to strike. The consequences of this German dominance were catastrophic for the Allied forces, most notably during the battles of Gazala in May and June of 1942. In those engagements, German forces systematically dismantled the British armored formations, destroying over 200 tanks and forcing the 8th Army into a humiliating retreat of 160 kilometers. The nadir of this period was the fall of Tobruk on the 21st of June, a fortress that had become a symbol of resistance, where over 10,000 South African soldiers from the 2nd Division were forced to surrender, marking the largest single loss of troops in South African military history. In this atmosphere of defeat, where British tanks could not match the range and killing power of German guns, and British infantry could not breach the solidified German defensive lines, the intelligence war belonged entirely to Rommel. However, amidst this backdrop of failure and retreat, there remained one element of the Allied force that consistently frustrated frustrated German operations and denied them total control of the desert. The South African Armoured Car Regiments. These regiments, equipped with vehicles manufactured in the industrial workshops of Johannesburg, controlled the reconnaissance battle in ways that the heavier, more cumbersome British tanks could never hope to replicate. The 4th South African Armoured Car Regiment operated in close coordination with the 7th British Armoured Division, the famed Desert Rats, while the 6th Regiment served across multiple formations, providing a flexible and ubiquitous presence on the battlefield. Together, along with the organic reconnaissance battalions of the 1st and 2nd South African Divisions, they fielded a massive force of approximately 640 armoured cars. This created a reconnaissance screen that German commanders frequently complained about in their official reports, describing it as thick and nearly impenetrable. It prevented German scout units from slipping through to gather accurate intelligence on the main bodies of the Allied army. The Germans monitored the radio traffic of the South African cars obsessively because they had learned, through painful experience, the dangers of ignoring them. When these cars appeared on the flanks at Gaza, German signals units frantically noted their positions, tracking them with a wary respect born of the knowledge that these vehicles were the eyes and ears of an army. They were trying to destroy. The irony of this tactical success lay in the humble, almost improvised nature of the vehicle responsible for it. The Marmon-Herrington armoured car. Unlike the purpose-built military machines of Germany or Britain, the Marmon-Herrington was a product of necessity, designed and built in South Africa, starting in 1939 when the looming threat of war made it clear that Britain could not supply its dominions with sufficient armour. The production of these vehicles was a triumph of civilian-industrial cooperation, involving entities that had never before engaged in military manufacturing. The Dorman Long Structural Steel Company in Germiston, just outside Johannesburg, was tasked with assembling the armoured bodies, while the Ford Motor Company of South Africa provided the chassis. The steel itself came from the South African Iron and Steel Industrial Corporation, and the all-important four-wheel drive conversion kits were imported from the Marmon-Herrington Company in Indianapolis, United States, with additional truck components shipped from Ford Canada. The result was a vehicle that looked exactly like what it was, a civilian truck chassis with an armoured box bolted on top, a hybrid machine born of desperation and ingenuity. The early models, particularly the Mark II, which formed the bulk of the early desert deployments, were far from impressive on paper. Weighing 6 tons combat loaded, they squeezed a crew of 4 driver, commander, gunner, and radio operator into a hot, noisy interior powered by a standard Ford V8 petrol engine producing roughly 85 to 95 horsepower. This was the same engine found in thousands of civilian delivery trucks across Africa and North America. Utterly ordinary, yet destined for extraordinary service. The armor protection was alarmingly minimal, with 12 mm of steel at the front and a mere 6 mm on the sides and rear, barely enough to stop small arms fire. A German 20 mm cannon could punch through this protection from a kilometer away, and even heavy machine gun fire posed a lethal threat to the crew inside. The armament was equally underwhelming, consisting of a Boy's .55 caliber anti-tank rifle and a .303 Bren light machine gun. By 1940, the Boy's rifle was already obsolete. While it could penetrate roughly 23 mm of armor at 100 yards, essentially effective only against light vehicles, it was useless against the 30 mm frontal armor of a Panzer III or the 50 mm of a Panzer IV. South African crews were acutely aware of these deficiencies, but rather than accepting their fate, they embraced a culture of radical field modification. Almost immediately upon arriving in the theater, crews began to discard the useless Boy's rifles and mount whatever heavier weaponry they could scavenge from the battlefield. They bolted on captured German 3.7 cm Pak 36 anti-tank guns, Italian Breda 20 mm cannons, and Italian 47 mm anti-tank guns, transforming their reconnaissance vehicles into mobile tank destroyers. These modifications were never official. There were no factory blueprints or standardized kits. The crews simply took what worked, welded or bolted it to the hull, and went back to war. Although the official designation was the South African Reconnaissance Car, nobody used that name. To the men who fought in them and the enemies who feared them, they were simply named after the American supplier of their drivetrains. The evolution of the vehicle continued with the arrival of the Mark III in 1941, which became the most numerous variant deployed to North Africa, with production reaching 2,630 units. This model saw the wheelbase shortened slightly, the empty weight dropped to 5.3 tons, and the crew reduced to 3 men to improve efficiency. The maximum road speed increased to 88.5 km/h, a critical improvement that allowed it to outpace outpace almost anything else on the battlefield. While the operational range remained at 322 kilometers on roads and 200 kilometers cross-country, the reliability and speed made it the preferred vehicle for the majority of British 8th Army reconnaissance units from late 1941 through mid-1942. South Africa eventually produced a staggering 5,746 Marmon-Herrington armored cars between 1939 and 1944, supplying not just their own troops but equipping British, Indian, New Zealand, Greek, Free French and Polish forces. Every major Commonwealth formation in the desert relied on these South African-built machines to some extent. By 1942, the design had matured into the Mark IV, a significant upgrade that finally introduced a proper 2-pounder 40mm gun in a turret, replacing the improvised weaponry of the earlier models. This gun could penetrate 53mm of armor at 500 yards, finally giving South African crews a fighting chance against German armor. However, the most revolutionary aspect of the Mark IV was its range. Vehicle datasheets quoted an operational range of 579 kilometers or 360 miles. This was an exceptionally long range for a desert armored car, allowing for deep penetration missions that could last for days without resupply. Although 2,116 Mark IVs were built, production timing meant that most arrived too late for the North African campaign, seeing their primary service in Italy and northwest Europe. Nevertheless, the lineage of the vehicle proved that South African industry could adapt and improve designs. Based on hard-won combat experience, the true value of the Marmon-Herrington, however, was not found in its armor, thickness or gun caliber. Areas where British tanks like the Matilda, Crusader and Grant held a clear advantage. The Crusader had a 2-pounder gun, the Grant a 75mm, and the Sherman superior armor, yet none could perform the reconnaissance role like the South African cars. The difference lay in two critical factors: speed and reliability. British tanks were notoriously slow. The Crusader managed 42 kilometers per hour on roads but dropped to 20 kilometers per hour cross. Matildas crawled at a painful 9.7 kilometers per hour, and even the American Sherman topped out at 40 kilometers per hour. In contrast, the Marmon-Herrington could hit speeds of over 80 kilometers per hour, making it twice as fast as the tanks it supported. This speed was not just a convenience, it was a tactical necessity. It allowed the armored cars to act as bait, rushing forward to provoke enemy fire and identify positions, then turning and escaping before German gunners could find the range. Reliability was perhaps an even greater factor in the unforgiving desert environment, where sand destroyed engines and heat cooked transmissions. British tanks suffered from chronic mechanical failures. Crusaders were plagued by cooling system damage and oil leaks caused by the abrasive sand, while Matildas suffered from constant engine overheating and steering failures. American Grants arrived with suspension issues, and Shermans burned through tracks and engines at an alarming rate, requiring frequent and extensive workshop time. For most British armored formations, maintenance consumed more time than combat. The Marmon-Herrington, however, was built on proven Ford truck components that were simple, robust, and familiar to mechanics all over Africa. Parts were easily available, and the maintenance requirements were minimal compared to the complex machinery of a tank. Unit reports from the time consistently highlighted a critical advantage. The Marmon-Herringtons invariably started first go in the desert, where morning temperatures could freeze engine blocks and afternoon heat could vaporize fuel. A vehicle that started reliably every single time was a lifeline. When facing German vehicles that were also engineered for high reliability, South African crews could not afford to waste precious minutes coaxing dead engines to life while under fire. This reliability translated directly into battlefield effectiveness, allowing commanders to plan operations with the confidence that their reconnaissance screen would not break down halfway to the objective. The combination of speed and reliability created tactical possibilities that British tanks simply could not exploit. If a Marmon-Herrington encountered a superior German force, it simply drove away. German Panzer III and IV tanks, with top speeds of around 40 to 42 kilometers per hour, had no hope of catching them in the open desert. This escape capability fundamentally altered the risk calculus for armored car crews. They could push their reconnaissance much further forward, probing deep into German lines and lingering to observe enemy movements, secure in the knowledge that they could withdraw faster than the enemy could pursue. British infantry tanks, once committed to a sector, fought until they won or were destroyed. They had no speed to retreat. South African armored cars fought only when they chose to fight and withdrew when the odds were unfavorable. Furthermore, the exceptional range of the vehicles, particularly the later models, enabled operations without the logistical tether that bound British tanks. A range of nearly 600 kilometers meant they could patrol 300 kilometers from base, gather intelligence, and return without refueling. British tanks required a constant stream of fuel trucks trailing behind them, a logistical tail that was vulnerable to attack and which telegraphed their movements to German observers. South African armored cars roamed the desert as free agents, appearing in sectors where the Germans did not expect them, and vanishing before a counterattack could be organized. This operational freedom allowed them to control the reconnaissance battle, a crucial element of modern warfare. While wars may not be won by reconnaissance alone, they are certainly lost without it. Knowing the enemy's location, strength, and direction of movement determines whether an army fights on ground of its own choosing or is forced into a reactive posture. While British tanks won the pitched battles through massed firepower, it was the South African armoured cars that determined where those battles took place. The 4th South African Armoured Car Regiment, serving as the eyes of the 7th Armoured Division, moved first, stopped last, and was, in the words of a British officer, always in touch with the foe. The density of the South African reconnaissance screen was such that German armoured cars, despite their technical superiority in direct combat, found themselves frustrated. The German SDKFC 222 and 231 were excellent vehicles, with superior autocannons and better armor protection than the Marmon-Herringtons. In a fair head-to-head fight, the German car would likely win. But South African crews had no intention of fighting fair. They used their superior numbers and speed to observe from a distance, withdrawing when the Germans advanced and following when they retreated, engaging in a perpetual dance of cat and mouse where they refused to be the mouse. The German reconnaissance units, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, could not push through this screen to see what the British main force was doing. Additionally, German vehicles suffered from limited range, requiring crews to strap dangerous jerry cans of fuel all over the exterior of their hulls just to conduct extended patrols, increasing their vulnerability to fire. The combat record of the South African armoured cars is punctuated by daring raids that leveraged their unique capabilities. On the 27th of May, 1942, at Gazala, it was the 4th South African Armoured Car Regiment that first spotted the massive dust cloud, signaling Rommel's main flanking attack. They identified the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, swinging round the line, providing the British command with accurate, timely intelligence on the German objective. Although Rommel moved too fast for the British reserves to intercept him effectively, the failure lay with the heavy armor's reaction time, not the intelligence provided by the South Africans. Later, on the 18th of December 1941, the 3rd South African Reconnaissance Battalion conducted a raid on the Luftwaffe airfield near Derna. Armoured cars provided the speed to reach the target and the fire support to suppress the defences, while Sikh infantry destroyed 12 Ru-52 transport aircraft and captured 300 prisoners. No British tank could have reached Derna and returned. Only the Marmon-Herringtons had the legs for the journey. Similarly, on the 9th of December 1941, a raid on an Axis tank repair depot by the Imperial Light Horse, supported by armoured cars, resulted in the destruction of 38 tanks that were awaiting repair. These tanks, including Panzer IIs and IVs, were destroyed with hand grenades and small arms fire, while the armoured cars held the perimeter. Every tank destroyed in that repair yard was one less tank facing the 8th Army at the next major battle. These raids had a strategic impact far exceeding the tactical effort involved, forcing the Germans to divert troops to guard rear areas they had previously thought safe. The climax of this raiding strategy came during the breakthrough at El Alamein in November 1942, where Reeves-Moore's regiment exploited the confusion to capture massive amounts of artillery. The psychological impact of seeing Allied armoured cars scampering at dawn in the German rear created a perception of total collapse, contributing to the panic that accelerated the German retreat. The Germans responded to the effectiveness of the Marmon-Herrington in the most sincere way possible. They captured them and used them. Rommel himself was notorious for using captured British command vehicles, but the Wehrmacht also readily adopted captured South African armoured cars into their own ranks. Photographic evidence confirms the 21st Panzer Division operating these vehicles, acknowledging their utility in the desert terrain. The Germans were pragmatic warriors. They used what worked, and the fact that they turned their captured prizes against their former owners speaks volumes about the vehicle's quality. They hated fighting against them because they were elusive, but they loved fighting in them because they were reliable. This duality encapsulates the unique status of the Marmon-Herrington in the North African campaign. The broader contribution of South Africa to the war effort was immense, with over 100 100,000 men and women serving in the Desert War. Despite the devastating loss of the 2nd Division at Tobruk, the 1st South African Division continued to fight with distinction. At Sidi Rezegh, the 5th South African Infantry Brigade was effectively destroyed, suffering massive casualties, yet their artillery managed to destroy 72 German tanks in direct fire before being overrun, proving the tenacity of the South African soldier. The 4th South African Armoured Car Regiment's permanent attachment to the 7th Armoured Division was a singular honour, recognising them as an elite unit worthy of serving alongside Britain's best. The legacy of the Marmon-Herrington extended far beyond the end of World War II. The design philosophy of high mobility, wheeled chassis, and long range suited for arid environments became the DNA of South African military vehicle design. The Mark IVF fought in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War with the Arab Legion, and remarkably saw combat during the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1974, 3 decades after its production. Greek forces used them in the Aegean Islands well into the 1990s. This incredible longevity was due to the vehicle's simplicity. No machine serves for 60 years unless it works reliably. This lineage traces directly to modern South African vehicles like the Eland and the Rui, which prioritized the same attributes of strategic mobility and operational range that made the Marmon-Herrington a legend in the desert. In the final analysis, while British tanks like the Churchill and Sherman provided the brute force necessary to smash the Axis armies in pitched battles, it was the South African armoured cars that provided the intelligence that made those victories possible. They won the information war, denying the Germans the ability to see while ensuring British commanders were never blind. They were the unsung workhorses of the 8th Army, operating in the vast, empty spaces of the desert, fighting a lonely war of observation and ambush. They frustrated a technologically superior enemy through sheer persistence, speed, and mechanical reliability. The hatred they inspired in German commanders was the hate born of impotence, the inability to catch a foe that was always watching, always reporting, and always just out of reach. The breakthrough on the 4th of November 1942 was a microcosm of their war, a daring, high-speed dash into the unknown that yielded disproportionate results, proving that in the vast expanse of the desert, speed and information were weapons as lethal as any cannon.